Good morning. This is Kenneth with the Advancing Equity Coalition here again with you, with Heather, to debrief the Committee of the Whole meeting last night from Minneapolis Public Schools. Heather, how are you doing today?
Great, thanks.
Good. So we are here to really debrief two major conversations that took place last night at the school board meeting. The first one was about the bell times in Minneapolis Public Schools and how they're doing a study on what bell times should change in order to really make their routes less complex, to create transportation savings, and also to make sure that students access after-school programming more equitably. The second presentation was about moving from phase two to phase three in distance learning and potentially phase four in the third quarter of the school year. And so these conversations were taking place. We were hearing more about what are the protocols in place. We heard from a Minneapolis Department of Health epidemiologist to talk about what are some of her concerns and what are some of the ways that we can make sure that we're taking precautions. Also, really a lot of good defining of terms, which I thought was helpful last night,
Good.
and helped us get a great understanding. So Heather, what were some of your takeaways from the meeting last night?
Well, I really thought Senior Officer DeVette really did a great job of kind of reminding us the why. So why did we have to do a bell time study? The reality is that there are many schools in our district that because of their bell times, they don't have access to after school programming, after school childcare. And by the way that happens, the way that which buildings have access to things and which buildings don't have access to those same programmings really fell along racial lines. And so we needed to live our values and really look at this. And it causes a lot of discomfort and a lot of angst when we start to talk about changing bell times. And by the way, there's just the change in general in Minneapolis Public Schools we'll be going through next year. But I thought you did a great job of bringing us all the way back to like this work is grounded in the fact that what we offer to some buildings versus what we offer to other buildings is inequitable, and we have to change in order to make that different.
Yep. And so, I thought it was significant for her to tell us, we save $120,000 for every route that we go down. And so, according to the bell time study that they've done so far, for every they're decreasing their routes by about 25%. And I believe it was like 44 bus routes that they're decreasing with, the new magnets and, community schools, shorter walk zones, all that stuff, which is a significant amount of money. I did some back of the envelope math, and we're looking at like $5 million of savings, which is, not anything to just, raise your nose at. So, and to then hear the superintendent talk about, this is really a reinvestment of dollars. This isn't just savings that we're just going to keep, but we're hoping to utilize that money to really get into, put them into academics and ensure that students have access to band across the city and, all these other offerings that are so important for students to have access to. But, the bell times themselves, they're hard, right? And, the district has always had really extreme bell times, but just because, again, of the complexity of the routes in our district and, where students are going to school and all that stuff. But we're talking about a 2-hour range in bell times, even with the new bell times that are being proposed. So the earliest a school will start is 7:30 a.m. The latest a school will start is 9:30 a.m. And then you have, 3 different times in between that students can really, or that schools will really be starting at. And then the earliest a school will end is 2 p.m. And then the latest a school will end is 4 p.m. And so that is significant. And we're talking about elementary school students who will be getting on buses as early as 7 a.m. I don't know about you, but for me this morning when I woke up at 7 a.m., it was very dark outside. And so, as we start to get deeper and deeper into, the winter, and we're looking at December, January, February, that's a very early time for schools to be starting and for students to be getting on the bus. And, it's just something for us to be thinking about and being considerate of.
Well, and I think that like one of the things that gets lost in this conversation is that in education, we're underfunded in general. And then we have a really struggling system in Minneapolis public schools. So we're not choosing between like good and better. We're choosing between like a set of values. Like we're not going to get everything that we want because we are losing students. We can talk about that a little bit more, but I think for Minneapolis public schools, it's like we could add more buses and add more optimal start times, but that has a cost. And we have to really think about where is it that we want to spend our limited resources. And that's hard. It's hard when you think about putting a kid on a bus at 6:25 in the morning. And also, it's hard to think about whether or not we really value integration in our city, in a redlined, really racist city that still underserves students of color.
Yeah, and just to make a quick point, I know you mentioned 6:25 as a time to get on the bus. I will say last night that Senior Officer DeVette did say that they are going to try their best to make sure that no student has to get on a bus earlier than 7 a.m. And they will add bus routes if necessary in order to make sure that that takes place. And I think the biggest concern here, I think all the community schools should have this concern, but really the citywide magnets.
Yep.
I'm not sure if people really understand where our magnet schools are currently, but we have zone magnets, so it's easier to get to magnet schools because you have to live in the zone to access those magnet schools. But for a citywide magnet, you could be coming from any corner of the city. And yes, thankfully, we have magnet schools that are now more centrally located. But still, to get to, let's say Hall from, if you're going to Hall and you live, in deep southeast Minneapolis, like that's a trek, especially on a bus. And so we're going to be trying to do
Yep.
really, really difficult things. And so they did make a commitment that they were going to try their best to make sure that no student has to be on a bus for longer than 45 minutes. And also that they won't need to be on a bus earlier than 7 a.m. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I think about, what are the implications of these early start times and these late start times, and these early end times and these late end times. And if I'm a parent, right, like I'm not sure if I'm making my decision on start times. I'll say that, obviously I don't have children, but when my mom was making decisions for me and where I go to school, start times wasn't a thing that we really were a consideration because we just knew where I was going to school. I didn't have actually as many options probably as, a lot of families do in Minneapolis. And so we just found the school that I wanted to go to that made the most sense for us. And that was the start time that was given. And so we just operated around that. That being said, my school started at 8 a.m. And I had after school programming options. And so, those are real things that, parents are dealing with. And, I would just say, as we're looking at 7:30 start times, I heard concern about the 7:30 start times from school board members yesterday, but I didn't really hear, what are some of the considerations that they would like the district to make and if they were going to change anything about the start times before they vote in November on those start times. And, if it were me, right, and, this is me, and like I'm not a school board member, obviously. I've just been following this work for a little bit, but I don't pretend to be an expert and know everything about what all the constituents want. But I would be really concerned about some of our schools that we know have been traditionally harder to fill, and then asking that school to be starting at 7:30. For example, we know that Hall has had a harder time with enrollment for the last several years, and just because they're turning into a magnet school, I think there's a hope that Hall will be a more full school and reach its capacity. But having a 7:30 start time doesn't necessarily help that, especially if you're trying to get students from South Minneapolis to come to North Minneapolis to go to a Hall. 7:30 start time is a really, really early time to ask your child to go across the city. And then another consideration that I would be thinking about is around walk zones. Like, do our community schools need to have 7:30 start times in areas where we've shrunk the walk zones because we felt they're more dangerous because of the crime maps that they looked at and all the work that they did in order to determine new walk zones for different schools according to the CDD. I would make sure that that was something that was looked at, and we just didn't hear those questions. They may have been asked, they may not have been behind the scenes, but I think those are considerations that I would ask the district to make.
Yeah, I mean, I really think one of the things that we kind of have to talk about is the dwindling enrollment in MPS. It's been an ongoing problem. I think one of the things that no one in our city wants to say is that we are still running a large amount of buildings for a shrinking pool of students.
Yeah, and this leads to making then hard decisions, right? Because if you want to capture enrollment, or sorry, if you want to capture savings and resources, we're given a finite amount of resources, and we can either spend them on, subsidizing small schools, or we can spend that on, improving bus routes so that we don't have as early or late start times, right? And unfortunately, like, as a city, we are not willing to have the hard conversations around closing schools. At this point, like you said, we are 20,000 students down from where our peak enrollment was, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and we we need to capture those savings. And right now, we're trying to do it in the most maybe politically feasible way possible by trimming the bus routes. And there are so many conversations during the comprehensive district design around, like, you're just doing this to save, to make transportation savings, like it's not worth it, blah blah blah. Like, we know that academics, we need to improve our academic programming and instruction in Minneapolis public schools, and the only way we're going to do that is by capturing more resources. And so for people to say, like, oh, trying to capture savings from transportation is like such a terrible thing to do, it's not a terrible thing to do. We need to reinvest that money, and unfortunately we're not willing to do the hard things by closing small schools, because that would be a way to capture the savings. We're not doing the things that are most efficient in order to make sure that our students get the best of what we can give them, because the city's not ready to have that conversation. People aren't ready to give up their child's specifically small school, because it makes them feel extra special, it makes them feel extra safe, which are, again, things that are important. But who says that we can't provide that at bigger settings as well? Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, you can see that I care a lot about this issue and think a lot about these trade-offs, but it's just hard.
Well, I think it comes down to like a finite system, and then who we value and what we value. And a lot of times when we go to make change, there's a lot of good stories and a lot of people care about a lot of things. But as a city and as a system, we have not valued, because we have not shown that students of color, families of color, and offering the best for them. We have valued transportation. We have valued a lot of other things. We clearly don't value academics for students of color, right?
Mhm.
And so I know that when we talk about giving things up, that's when we have a lot of feelings. And I do too. I'm a parent. I don't want to give up a start time that works for my family. But I also think that I have to keep that in mind in the scope of this system that is drastically, horrifically, I mean, I don't have enough Lee words to talk about how horribly we are failing students of color who deserve better. And so it's not going to be a matter of choosing between this amazing thing and this amazing thing. It's going to cost us hard things.
Yeah. And so I think, bringing this back to the bell time study, that's why we have these tensions that we have to live with, right? And so,
That's right.
if you really want, more optimal bus times, we have to find money somewhere else, because at the end of the day, Minneapolis Public Schools is about academic instruction and ensuring that students get their academic needs met. But when it comes to doing things like laying off staff and making sure that we close buildings, like, those are conversations that no one wants to have because it's not politically feasible. And this isn't all to say, like, this is on the backs of the school board. Like, the school board has to take on more personal, more political fire conversations than any other elected official really has to. And our other Minneapolis elected officials do not take this up, right?
That's right. That's right.
Not to say that they, they aren't taking on hard topics, right? Like there are so many things that are happening in our city, in our community. Um, but they stay away from education with a 10-foot pole, right? And it's very intentional. Um, and so I think the bell times are important. I will say again that we have these like really early bell times that create some challenges, and also the early bell times provide opportunities for after school programming
That's right.
and that's a trade-off that if I were a parent, like that probably matters a little bit more to me. And as a parent, you should speak to this. I shouldn't, but that probably what I've heard and what I can imagine is that matters more to me to ensure that if I can't pick my child up at 2 o'clock or be home at 2:30 when their bus arrives, that they're at a safe place to be, or they're getting academic enrichment of some sort.
Well, because right, it look, the enrichment part of the programming are the thing that can sometimes spark the interest in the learning, and we deny that systemically to students of color in our district. Let's just say that plain.
Yeah. So just to quickly transition, we'll do a little short thing about the distance learning conversation. But last night they talked a little bit about moving to phase 3, potentially phase 4 in quarter 3, I should say. And so this has caused a lot of frustration amongst a lot of folks in the district. And I think a couple of the biggest things that have caused frustration is one, the date November 9th, because that's the beginning of quarter 2, has been floated around as when students and teachers should be going back to school at a higher rate than we've currently seen. What we heard last night is November 9th is just the beginning of quarter 2, and it's just for planning purposes. There is no plan to send students back into the building currently. As far as we know, there is no plan to send students and teachers back into the building as soon as November 9th. It's just the beginning of the ramping up that they would consider. The other part around this is that both the students and staff are doing so on a voluntary basis going back to buildings. And so there is no requirement that students or staff need to be back in buildings immediately. So what were some of your initial takeaways? And I'll pull up the slide that talks about some of the other components of phase 3.
I mean, I think that Superintendent Graff did a really great job of sort of talking about the fact that like we are choosing between like an academic need and a safety need. And we're just trying to balance those. And there is nothing that is going to be a scenario that's going to be able to meet everybody's needs. So it's just a matter of balancing those out. And he kind of said like, there's so many unknowns, and what I can't give people is a known, right? And so I think what I heard was that my students are, not likely to be back inside of a building before February, if at all. That's what I heard. I did hear a real commitment toward meeting the needs of students who are really struggling, who are getting lost, students who are experiencing homelessness. I heard them talk a lot about prioritizing students for special ed. Some of these students in special ed programming literally have not had supports for 6 months now. And so I think that I know we all want things and we're all feeling anxious, and I hear a lot of things about how distance learning isn't working, but I really think that I personally want to see the students who have those needs get their needs met, and my families will just have to sit on the back burner for right now. And I just kind of felt like that was what I heard, the priorities happening. I also think there's a lot of tension about forcing teachers back into buildings. And what I heard was that teachers are going to be allowed to volunteer for this next phase. And I think that I have complicated feelings about all of these things, but I agree that right now going to the next phase, I think we have to try our best to sort of like meet needs of the highest needs kiddos.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really difficult. There's been some buzz in the atmosphere about a potential strike by the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers for multiple reasons. I think part of it is they're feeling like they're not being invited to the table to negotiate with the district administration around the conditions to go back to school. I think some other folks are upset about the current schedule of distance learning and the amount of synchronous versus asynchronous learning that's taking, or instruction that's taking place. And, these are all things that are difficult. And, I hope that we can see the district and the union come together and to find an agreement. But, at the end of the day, I also want to know, like, what is going to be the best for kids.
That's
And, we talked a little bit about this during our shorter video. But we're very clearly hearing the needs that need to be met in terms of safety, by, again, Senior Officer DeVette, who did an amazing job. Also, I would say Associate Superintendent Cox has done an amazing job,
yes.
walking us through, some of the, like the data, the information. We heard from the epidemiologist last night as well. What we're not hearing is academics. Like, where are the needs that need to be met? What are we doing to meet those needs? What are we mitigating during distance learning? What's changing? What's shifting? But also, like, then what needs to be offered and how does it need to be offered if we're going to move more to in-person? Because I think, there's also we talked a little bit about the survey results that are happening. And what I've also heard pretty clearly from folks is, how am I supposed to answer this survey when I don't know what hybrid will look like? And, I think part of that is we just have an absence of a clear plan and focus from academics around what this is all going to look like. And it feels really frustrating to, again, have an academic institution that shies away from talking about academics.
Yeah, and I mean, yes, and we need, and part of the academics, if the majority of our students are not going to be in a building before February 4th, then it seems like we have to talk about the schedule we are all being asked to live underneath. And that is, from what I understand, an academic conversation. And if teachers are saying this is too much of a schedule, and if families are saying this is too much of a schedule, then I need someone to tell us, like, where we are going to change or do something about the schedule. And our experience in our home, I see emails from some teachers just saying, like, I have to take a grading day. We're not having class tomorrow. And I think, there are, like, if we are expecting work of students and we are giving assignments and then teachers are not being able to grade it because they are literally working too many hours, like okay, so we just need to drop a day. Now I'm kind of going into my opinion, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the debrief is for. So I'm happy to hear your opinion on it, especially as a parent that's at home with your two kids as they're going through distance learning every day, and needing to figure out what's easy and hard about it. But I think that's all we got for this video. So please be sure to share it. If you haven't already checked out our shorter video, check out our most valuable moment, check out our do better moment, and let us know what you think. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.